Welcome to the Teach Better Talk podcast, your official podcast for the Teach Better Podcast Network, the hub for all things education, brought to you by teachbetter.com. The Teach Better Talk podcast is committed to answering your burning questions through a variety of lenses and bringing new offers to you and your colleagues to help you thrive throughout the school year. My name is Ray Hewart, and we love your questions here on the pod. If you have any questions that you'd love us to consider as topics for future episodes, please share them with us by emailing info@teachbetter.com.
What is the keystone to all assessment? We are discussing assessment all week long, and it has been a wild ride already. I cannot wait for this conversation. Before we get too far in, I do want to give a shout out to Andrea, a part of our Teach Better team. Andrea is such a core member of our team, constantly sharing her knowledge, her positivity, and her creative nature as the co-founder of our ambassador program. I know our ambassador program is something a lot of you have asked about, and don't worry, applications will open soon. We'll keep you updated on that. But shout out to Andrea, who's doing so many beautiful things in that space to support our Teach Better family. Another person, a part of our Teach Better family, the reason we are all here, our guest, the boss man, Chad Ostrowski's in the house. Chad, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Ray. How are you?
Good. I'm so stoked that I stole you for the show. I mean, you are constantly out and about supporting our schools, and I don't know how I found the 1 hour where I could steal your attention, but I'm thrilled that we were able to do this.
I feel like I had to pull some strings to just make it on the podcast. So I'm glad to be here.
It's so good. We aren't going to get into it now, but we are going to talk about assessment. And I know this has been a really popular training that people have been looking for. I know our clients kind of, like our schools kind of do it all different ways. But what it seems like is there's like a little bit of fluff with a really fun, inspiring keynote at the beginning of the year. And then the work that they're dedicated to building throughout the year, which is kind of where we are now, is focused on assessment understanding. So I do appreciate you coming on and talking about this, because I know you are constantly having conversation around it.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to dive in.
Before we get too far in, Chad, I can only imagine that everybody listening to Teach Better Talk knows who you are. But just in case we have some new listeners, do you mind sharing a little bit about who you are, what you do, all that great stuff?
Absolutely. My name's Chad Ostrowski. I'm the CEO and the co-founder of the Teach Better team. I get to work with the amazing Ray Hewart on a daily basis, which is a reward in and of itself. But I get to work with schools, districts, and teachers across the country and spread the Teach Better message, our trainings, and all of our development, from mastery learning in the grid method, which is this crazy idea I came up with 10 years ago in the classroom that started it all, to everything in between, from assessment to depth of knowledge to classroom management to PBL and authentic learning and all of the above, right? So I am privileged to get to do this work with the team, and I'm privileged to continue to drive this work as we continue to do it across the country, really.
You know, I know that there are so many things that the team does training on, but obviously focusing on assessment, we'll be sharing as much as humanly possible with you today as far as how the team is able to support with assessment design. I know we kind of, you know, we're going to highlight the true keystone of assessment, which I'm very excited for. Before we get into that, though, a lot of people have been interested in the 360 wheel. It's obviously one of the sponsored elements of our podcast. I see it all over our social media. And for educators who might be seeing this colorful spinning wheel, but not know how it applies to them, regardless of what job they have in the education space, do you mind sharing a little bit about the Teach Better team's 360 wheel?
Absolutely. And I'm super thrilled, because this is a tool I've been pulling out of my pocket. And I feel like in every single conversation I have with administrators, with teachers, with department heads, with superintendents, like you name it, like I'm sharing this tool and the evaluation tool that we have over and over and over again. And essentially what this tool is we've done so much PD and so much development and worked with so many schools that we sort of whittled down all of that experience and all of that work to a kind of list of like non-negotiable foundational principles of high quality instruction, right? So we put those things, everything from instructional planning to assessment and question design, to understanding your standards and prioritizing them, to innovative instruction like the grid method or teach further or instructional models, and then grading, feedback, and communication of student progress, and then even cultural pieces like trauma informed, SEL, and everything in between. So in my opinion, the 360 model is a holistic approach to moving the needle for your school or your district. And one of the reasons we call it the 360 model is no matter who we're working with, they don't tend to just linearly follow this progression. We can set up the progression for staff, but what tends to happen is they might start at mastery learning, which is like the middle of the progression, but then we might realize, hey, they don't really understand their standards, so we have to cover some depth of knowledge or unpacking those standards. Or maybe they really want to focus on grading, but they haven't gotten their assessment locked down. So what we found is instead of like a linear progression, most development for adults, teachers, and schools tends to be circular in nature, where we're revisiting topics as needed to support further progression in the work. So to me, like the 360 model truly kind of embodies all of that into a simple, streamlined, easy to read, colorful tool that you can go see on our website.
Absolutely. We'll be featuring it later in the show. And of course, if you're interested in actually looking into every single category, this could actually be a really cool audit. Even if you're a classroom teacher, to go on and be like, do I cover these topics? Am I intentional with these topics? That's really all it is am I somebody who is cognizant that these elements need to exist in my classroom? And whether I'm just doing it naturally because it's in my routine, or I'm putting emphasis on it because it's an area I'm working on, am I covering all these metrics? It's a really good spot to go to. If you're a leader in a building and you're looking for ideas on what feedback to give while walking through classrooms during very casual observations, this is just an easy list to kind of peek at and be like, okay, I'm going to focus on my blue area. I'm going to focus on the red area today. All of those are going to encompass a really great classroom.
And to that point, for leaders, I think it's especially useful because it's great reflection on what you've fully covered formally, what you've talked about kind of, and what you haven't really talked about, so you shouldn't be expecting anything from. Yeah. So like I've actually been using it a ton with leaders to evaluate, okay, just because you said it in a meeting doesn't mean you can expect that in the classroom. Just now, but the thing that we had 3 trainings on and 4 support sessions on, we need to be doubling down on seeing that in classrooms every day. And this thing that we haven't touched on, but you want to touch on, maybe we put that on the training schedule for next year or the winter or something like that. So I absolutely love the tool. I think it streamlines the entire conversation, but I think it's just a great tool, to your point, for any educator, regardless of their position, to just do some self-reflection and go, where do I feel like I'm at, my classroom's at, my school's at, or my district's at on any of these areas? Because I'm telling you right now, whether you work with a Teach Better team or anybody else, they're covering those same pillars of instructional, high quality, effective strategies. So like, those are going to be in play regardless. And if they're not in play, they may be areas you want to focus on.
Oh, so good. All right, let's get off topic here really quick because we are going to get into assessment here in just a bit. Chad, you are a co-founder of the Teach Better team. And therefore, even though your background is in a classroom teaching, you have since been working with administrators to facilitate really in-depth training for school districts all around the country. And in addition to that, you're a business owner, which probably was not where you thought you were going to be. Do you mind sharing a bit around why you decided to start this wacky community? Because the Teach Better family is very loud and proud, and we love our little family, but it really wouldn't exist without some stupid idea you had.
Yeah, I think what it came down to is it started as a simple way to share an idea to help teachers reach more students, and turned into, with the help of you and many others, a powerful international community of teachers moving education forward. And I think the idea of a business and starting it was never in my plans. However, what it comes down to, and when I reflect back is impact, right? As a classroom teacher, we often think about our impact as how many students did I teach this year and move. So maybe 20, 30, 120 kids per year if you're a middle or a high school teacher, somewhere around there. And if you have something that works in education and you can impact exponentially more students by showing others what has worked and impacted your own classroom, you can increase those metrics. And something we've been very fortunate and lucky, and I'm honored to have the history that we do and have grown as much as we have. Something that I'm honored about is that not only do we just talk about the grid method, which is what started it all, but now we're helping teachers move the needle from wherever they're at. So if they're not ready for the grid method, we can help them tweak their assessment. If we're not ready for assessment, maybe we can just help them better understand the depth and complexity of what they're doing in their classroom. But always moving that needle, always having that philosophy of better every single day has really been a driving force. So I didn't really plan for all this to happen, but it happened organically and grew in a way that I think we're all really proud of on the team. And I'm excited to see where it goes from here, to be honest.
Friends, if you are listening to this podcast over on Teach Better Talk, you are a part of the family. If you're watching over on YouTube at the Teach Better team, you are a part of the family. If you have ever engaged with Chad or anyone else on the team, you're a part of the family. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. And a special thank you to you, Chad, for kind of bringing us all together and this wacky little family of educators committed to being a little bit better each and every day. It's kind of fun to have the OG on the pod to really celebrate how far we've come.
Yeah, I mean, I tell this to teachers on a daily basis, every single week as we're traveling and working with schools. But like, if teachers never trusted us to try something new, none of this would ever happen. So when you thank them for being part of the family, they're truly the reason we do everything we do. Because if no one ever listened or tried anything new because of what we shared with them, it never grows, right? And so I'm unlimited amounts of thankful. There's a better word I should have used there, but I didn't. But I have an unwavering amount of gratefulness for every single teacher that uses a resource, finds a link to a blog, or watches a video, or listens to this podcast, or goes to a training and applies something to make themselves better in the classroom. Because that's really, really at the core of everything we do on the team.
So good. We're going to dive into the keystone of assessment, our theme this week. Stick with us.
Quick pause to talk about the Teach Better team's 360 approach to professional development. Now, we know that the Teach Better team was originally founded on mastery learning practices, but we know there is so much more that takes to building a successful school. Head over to teachbetter.com/professional development to look at the Teach Better team's 360 rollout plan, your complete path to lasting educational transformation. It includes personalized student success plans, progressive instruction, aligned content implementation, a supportive environment, true long-term change, and more than anything, time for teachers. Head over to teachbetter.com/professional development to see the whole system in action.
How are we approaching assessment, and what is the keystone of making it successful each and every time? We are here with Chad Ostrowski, and we are diving into this topic. Don't forget, each and every episode, each week is going to be focused on a centralized theme, and we all know that assessment is one we can always be a learner within. Chad, when we talk about the keystone of assessment, a lot of educators are going to question what you might want to dive into here. What is the topic that actually creates this foundation for assessment? We might have a lot of guesses. So what is your answer to what truly allows assessments to be successful? Is it how we form our questions, the medium we use? Like what's the trick here? What's the secret?
So there's a single question I ask every educator anytime I'm looking at their assessment. And it doesn't matter if it's formative, if it's summative, if it's a rubric, if it's a project, or if it's a play-based station in a kindergarten classroom. And it's always the same question. And this question, I think, is the keystone of all assessment is, what are you trying to measure? Knowing the outcome of learning that you are trying to measure with the assessment, in my opinion, is the keystone of everything that comes after. Because if you don't start with that, knowing what you're trying to measure specifically, you are guessing at everything else. You are guessing at everything from the depth of the questions to the types of the questions to the content that's covered in the questions. So if we don't know specifically what are the objectives, the targets, and the outcomes that we are trying to measure with the assessment, we're already starting behind the 8 ball. And you're not going to be able to create any sort of quality assessment there. So the keystone of assessment is knowing the objective you're trying to measure, knowing the outcome you're trying to measure, or being able to answer the question, what am I measuring? Because assessment is a tool. Like that's something like that's a foundational philosophical piece that I think a lot of teachers forget, because assessment gets labeled a lot of things: evil, horrible, awful, wastes of time, because everything from state assessments to mandated assessments to digital assessments that come with our curriculum or our MAP scores and everything in between. Assessment has been villainized, but at its core, assessment is simply a tool to measure student understanding of something. And if you don't know what that something is, everything else starts to fall apart.
Yeah, when I was early in my career, I know there was so many assessments I gave because it was just the end of chapter 4 assessment.
Right.
And when you asked me what I was measuring, I'm measuring chapter 4. I'm measuring if they learned chapter 4. And it wasn't until I started almost having a more strategic approach to formative assessments that I started seeing the actual value assessments could bring me. You know, like I would do the exit slips at the end of a lesson, and then I would throw them away because they don't do anything for me. I don't need them, right? Like how many of us, I know it can't just be me, how many of us have asked students to do a little exit slip at the end? Maybe I flipped through it, but overall, I know what I'm teaching tomorrow and I know what students didn't get and I need to review. So I'm just recycling constantly. That's my life. And that is maybe not what we're supposed to do. I don't know.
Well, I think you're bringing up a great point of like, now we're talking about use of data, right? So if we're using the tool, but not using the data, we shouldn't have used the tool in the first place. Yeah. And a lot of times we're using the tool because there's a checkbox somewhere on an observation or a lesson plan or a walkthrough form or fill in the blank with whatever expectations given to you as a teacher. And we go, well, I'm supposed to do this, so I'm doing this, but I'm never going to actually use it or look at it. And that's a waste of everybody's time if we're never using it. But it also devalues the opportunity that assessment provides for students. So something as an educator I always did is I reversed the narrative that assessment was a bad thing in my own classroom. We talk to teachers about this a lot, where students should view assessment as an opportunity to prove to us what they've learned or what they know, not as a judgment on what they don't know.
Yeah, it's not a gotcha.
Right. It's an opportunity to go, what do you know so far, so we can continue this journey? Not, if you don't do well, you're never going to get another chance.
The way that this became easier for me, and I'm not trying to give the grid method a shout out again, but it really was the grid method, because the ability for students to move at their own pace gave me the freedom to put less stress on the assessment and use it more as an opportunity to figure out what else they need in terms of support. And it wasn't going to affect anyone else except for the student and I figuring out what they need. And the other element that really helped with the grid method is it's so segmented out that in this section, we're focusing on this goal, and in this section, we're focusing on this outcome. So my formative assessments would be so strategic because there was only one clear thing we were trying to get out of it, and it was short.
And even in our training, we switched. We used to call the end of a formative assessment, we used to call those mastery checks. We actually changed this language. I don't even know when it was. We changed this language to checks for understandings or checks for readiness to continue learning, because that's actually a more appropriate name for those formative checks. Are you ready to continue learning without a deficit that will prevent you from doing so? Like, that's the actual question I want to answer with a formative check. Can you continue learning without a deficit that will stop you from doing so? And if that's true, we are good to continue. But if it's not, we need to revise and re-strategize here how to get you there.
I love that phrasing. So if I'm an educator reflecting on being more intentional with my desired outcome, what am I measuring? How big or small should this concept be? I know that's a very vague question, but I find that as a teacher, I lean more to like so specific, but you can actually have a number of different things you measure as long as you know what questions match with that outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I give a student 10 questions, I might really be looking from the learning experience the student had for how they respond to 3 of those questions. Like, so the key thing that I'm looking for from the learning experience that they had, if they get those 3 right and the rest of them wrong, they could still be ready to continue learning, because those were the key takeaways or outcomes I was looking for from the plan or the learning experience that they experienced. And I think a lot of times we get stuck. We get stuck in the idea that like the assessment itself has inherent value. And the assessment actually has no value. It's just a tool. Like a measuring tape doesn't have value. The metric that the data I get from it does. So like, I don't care which ruler I use. I care that the data I'm getting is valid. And I think the same thing is something we forget in the classroom, because if I know the outcome, how the student reaches or demonstrates that outcome is now fair game. Whether they did the whole worksheet or verbally explain it or draw me a picture or a diagram or do a voice note or write hieroglyphics, for all I care, smoke signals, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as they're reaching the outcome I'm desiring, the way in which they do it is irrelevant, which now we're getting into sort of universal design for instruction and differentiated learning and all these other practices. But if, once again, though, if I don't know the outcome, the value has to be placed on the artifact, which is the assessment. If I know the outcome, the value is now placed on what the student is demonstrating with that artifact. So if you don't start with the keystone of knowing the outcome, now all the value is on that one sheet of paper you give the student after the worksheet or the activity that they were supposed to do to assess their learning. Because now that's the only thing I have saying that do they know what they're supposed to. But if I inherently understand the purpose of the learning happening in my classroom and the outcome and objective I'm reaching, now that's just a measuring stick. I can get another measuring stick and see and measure the same thing, and it doesn't matter how the student shows. It doesn't even matter if they complete it, if they can show it in a different way. Maybe they do 3 instead of 10 examples of a math problem, and it still demonstrates the same objective. So there are teachers right now listening to this going, but what about that lazy kid that doesn't even do the assessment? I got a life hack for every teacher right now listening to this, okay? Go to that student. You don't need to make a neon sign. You don't need to get a megaphone and say this. You get real close and you just kind of whisper and you go, hey, I don't need you to do all this. Can you just do 3? Can you show me that you can do 3? Or even better, if you already know how to do this, prove that to me and you don't have to. Like, I want you to try this with your lowest motivation student. 9 times out of 10, that student every single time will now be like, are you serious? Like, are you joking with me right now? Because they don't believe that you're willing to break the rules of the system they've been in their entire academic career. But we are doing something very critical here. We're valuing knowledge over what they're doing. Like, we're valuing the outcome and the objective that they are demonstrating over how they demonstrate it. And once students understand that, they will also begin, it doesn't happen overnight, to value that knowledge too. So every teacher wants to say that, right? Like, I'm getting excited now, I apologize. But every teacher I get this complaint all the time. They just don't care to learn, or they just don't want to learn. False. That is not true. Every single child, when they are born, is evolutionarily wired to learn as much about the world as they possibly can. It's why kids jump in puddles, why they play in mud, why they throw sticks, why they jump and try to fly off of things that is not physically possible. They are literally trying to learn about the world around them. You cannot tell me that that just stops for no reason. And if it does stop, it's because we train them to stop. So if we want to train them to love learning and knowledge, we have to value those things in our classroom and model things that do so as well.
We're in a tirelessly good conversation around task completion versus knowledge. I love this. And this is a really great point for all of you listening, regardless of what you teach, to know that we're happy to talk on this anytime people want. Chad, I know that people reach out to you constantly. I myself, early on in our friendship, I would call you and be like, I don't know how to do this. Talk me through it. And I'm standing in the middle of my classroom trying to problem solve. So there's a lot of good things here, but I love the focus on knowledge versus task completion and needing to know the outcome. And the outcome, the desired measurable thing, can be as teeny tiny as students knowing how to borrow when they subtract, or it can be as large as some of the other components like a full standard understanding, but you have to know where you're going.
But that's a great example, right? Like the one you just gave for a math classroom, understanding how to borrow. So this is actually a great like sort of case for why this makes sense, or a case I can make for why this is a good practice. If my focus and my outcome is the student understands how to borrow, my focus is not, can the student do arithmetic? So if they borrow correctly in an example, but do the math wrong because they calculate it wrong, I can still celebrate the growth of the student for meeting the objective. But if I just go, did you do everything right? Yes or no? Now I've covered up my actual objective with a bunch of other stuff. Like the same thing happens with writing, where we tear apart a student's paper, but our actual objective is like, can you cite your sources correctly? So like really, if I'm tearing your grammar apart, but you cited everything perfectly, now I'm confused as a student because I think I did a bad quote unquote job when I met the objective that you originally set forth.
Well, and I think that's really important. I loved this component. I was using the grid method, but this could be done in any type of teaching and instructional model. I loved the ability to always find something to celebrate, because
finding wins for kids. Absolutely.
Yeah. I might still need them to do 100 things they didn't do, but I now have then that's fine. I'm not saying that they don't need to know how to spell or they don't need to know how to do arithmetic. Either way, though, I have something that I can celebrate and I can easily identify areas to reteach. And isn't that the goal? Like the goal isn't for them to do it perfectly, because you know what? Then I've done my job too well. It's actually to look at where do we need to go and what have we already covered. And I loved being able to segment every single conversation with students where it was able to have at least one win and at least one area of growth. And that made for a really enjoyable learning experience for everyone, myself included.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on a huge component here. Like a base level objective for every classroom should be find more wins than losses for the students in your room. Find those wins by knowing what you're actually measuring. It doesn't mean you're giving out participation trophies, to be clear, but you're finding those small wins that you can build on instead of just creating barriers that are stopping progress, right? So like we need to do that self-reflection and that kind of reevaluation of what's happening in our classroom. Like when that kid's not excited to come in, yes, are you having a positive attitude? Do you have a good environment and a culture? But are you creating a scenario in an arena where they're winning? Like, are you giving them wins to celebrate every single day? Yes or no? And if you're not, maybe they're not going to be as motivated. It's just an idea, but.
I have one final question for you here, Chad. I know we're going to run out of time and we're going to get to our major takeaways, but I have found that the more assessments I do, the more specific I can be. I wonder if some of the issues with assessments and being really intentional with what you're measuring is that you may not be doing it frequently enough and you feel like you have too many things you have to measure either at the end of a unit or whatever. Is it possible that educators should be assessing more than maybe they feel like they are, because in their mind an assessment is like a formal test with no talking that everyone takes at their desk?
Yeah, everything is data. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Whether a student throws a chair, isn't working, puts their head down, all this is data. You're giving different types of assessments for those things, but like everything is data. And so I think oftentimes we put assessment into literally this little box of paper, pencil, multiple choice, 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10, 15 out of 15 points. When student conferencing, dialogue when you're doing a check-in, participation in a group conversation, thumbs up, thumbs down, like explain it to a friend, like 50,000 different ideas could come into play here. Graded discussions, Socrative seminars, PBLs, rubric, like whatever you want to call it, like you could do any of these things and they're just as valid as everything else. It just determines, are you measuring the outcome you want to see? Like, and if you are, it's a valid assessment. So don't beat yourself up that everything has to be 5 points in the grade book. A 30-second conversation, I can get more from a 30-second conversation with a student than I can from a 50-point question test that's from the curriculum company. I absolutely agree and believe that in my soul, because when the student starts humming and hawing and can't articulate themselves or can't figure out how to explain something, or just you see that blank stare across their face, that's also an assessment. So I think we have to look at assessment more holistically, to your point, and but we can't do that, in my opinion, if we don't know the objectives we're trying to measure. And what I'm not saying, just because I know someone in the comments might say this later, how am I supposed to know every objective for every, how can I only do one objective for every assessment I give? You can assess multiple objectives and outcomes with a single task or a single assessment, but you still have to know what those are. That's all I'm going to say about that. I'm not saying you can only do one at a time. I just know that's coming from someone somewhere, but I just wanted to get it in there before the end of the episode.
I love it. Guys, stick with us. We'll be right back for some major takeaways and, of course, contact information. We've been diving into the keystone of assessment, which is all about knowing your desired outcome here with Chad Ostrowski. Chad, before we get into your contact information, I would love to have you share one major takeaway that you hope people truly keep in mind after this episode. I know it's going to be tough to identify just one, but you got to do it.
So one major takeaway, I'll do it as a single statement. If you know the outcome of what you're measuring with an assessment, how a student demonstrates that outcome becomes irrelevant.
So good.
That's my, I guess, my big neon sign takeaway for this week's episode there.
I love it. And I can't wait to continue these conversations all week long as we dive into assessment. Don't forget, friends, every single week we are diving into your pressing questions and trying to get you support from multiple perspectives. Chad, before we wrap up here, I do want to make sure our community can add you to their PLN. I'm sure they already are connected with you as Mr. Founder of the Teach Better team, but we also want to make sure if we have any newbies that they're able to reach out to you as well. Maybe they'll even have assessment questions. They'll want to send you an email. So how can we stay connected?
Shoot me an email at chad@teachbetter.com, or you can follow me on X or Facebook if you want.
Friends, it's so easy. If you have any issue connecting with Chad, you can always reach out to me or anyone else on our team. We know how to hunt him down. Chad, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely.